Thanks very much. It's great to see everyone in the same room for the first time ever. It's really wonderful. This conference is an important step in the process of developing a deeper engagement with other actors in the fight against poverty. And it comes at a time of truly tremendous change in the demographic, geopolitical, economic, and social environments in which we're operating, with enormous implications for our work and our mission. And what I'd like to do over the next 10 minutes or so is say a few words about this broader context for the discussions we'll be having in the next few days. Some of the things I'll say are very general, broad trends that will be somewhat familiar to you, I'm sure. Others perhaps more specific. I'd like to start with the demographic transition. We're at the halfway point in a 90-year demographic transition that is the most profound in human history. In this 90-year period, you see a huge increase in population growth, and then you see it decreasing at the end of the 90-year period very steeply. And during the second half, in the next 45 years, we're going to see at least another 3 billion people added to the planet. And virtually all of that increase is going to be in developing countries that are already under enormous stress. We held our General Assembly, the CARE International General Assembly meeting in Ethiopia last year, hosted by Abby and her very able and generous team. And one of the really striking changes that I noticed after having been away for a while and coming back was a flight from Addis into the countryside. The size of the farms, the paddocks, the patchwork quilt, had become so tiny that they actually looked like burial plots rather than farms. And of course, what had happened is parents had subdivided their properties and subdivided again. And I asked my colleague from our national staff colleague, what's going to happen in the future with Ethiopia's population growth? And he said, we're going to be fighting each other over food. In Nigeria, in 1950, there were about 30 million people. That number tripled between 1950 and 95, and it's projected to triple again between now and 2050. That's a tenfold increase potentially in one person's lifetime. That has enormous implications for us at the broadest possible level. Now, linked to this transition, that demographic transition, is obviously the implication of how you feed all these additional people, and food security has been in the news a lot recently. There's an estimate that I've seen from SIGAR, which is one of the policy institutes, that suggests that over the next 40 years, as much additional food will need to be produced as humankind has produced since the very beginning of agriculture. So this is an awesome development as we move forward. Now, linked to this and complicating issues such as food security is climate change, which of course is a consequence of our patterns of development and the fact that there are many more people now following that pattern of development. And we know that this climate change is already increasing the frequency and severity of natural disasters. It's exacerbating complex emergencies, political emergencies, countries in conflict. A good example is Darfur, where a prolonged drought is very closely associated with the increase in fighting, a deep and prolonged drought, which is not to say that it was the cause, it's certainly a contributing cause, but the links between environment and political conflicts are clear as well. And it's going to threaten to plunge additional tens of millions of people into extreme poverty as a result of sea level rise and the other changes. Now, I think one of the very striking consequences of these various trends is that they will increasingly blur the distinction between humanitarian relief on the one hand and development on the other. That distinction's already blurring, but it's going to blur increasingly in the years ahead. By 2010, half of the world's poorest people could be living in countries devastated or threatened by violent conflict. 2/3 of the countries that are currently off track to achieving the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, are countries experiencing violent conflict. And climate change, as I've said, is going to blur this distinction even further, for example, requiring much more attention to areas like disaster risk reduction. Women and children are 14 times more likely to die than men from these disasters, in these disasters. And up to 80% of the people killed in the Asian tsunami were women. So again, this distinction's blurring between emergencies and development, but also our approach to solving them is actually quite consistent. In the case of development, the focus on women is key. In the case of emergencies, the focus on women is key. The distinction is blurring. A third very important trend that we're witnessing is the emergence of new centers of power in the global south. And just to give you a few aspects, very general aspects of this, there is Chinese investment in Africa, which I know we're all very aware of. That's jumped from something like 10 billion in 2000 to 40 billion in 2006. Non-OECD donors, to give you another indication of this change, are now responsible for 12% of humanitarian financing each year. And even if you focus on fundraising, the future innovation and fundraising growth is shifting to Asian markets as well in a number of important respects. One other angle on this is the rise of local NGOs and networks including regional networks of southern local NGOs. This was a really striking feature of this recent Accra high-level meeting on aid effectiveness, where having worked with AusAid, a government aid agency, on the aid effectiveness agenda with the OECD, 7 or 8 years ago, and now attending this meeting in Accra, the degree of organization of the NGO community and their engagement, including very dynamic networks of regional NGOs, was a really striking change over the last 7 or 8 years. And bilateral aid donors, whom CARE relies on actually more than do other international NGOs, are adjusting their own operations in response to these various realities. For example, the EU is untying its aid, channeling more of its funds directly to recipient governments and to local NGOs, and asking very tough questions about the added value of northern NGOs in this equation.